Amazing Couples by Victor Yep and Doris Mock. Chapter 9. How Rude. 1 Samuel chapter 25. Public Agenda, a non-profit group, interviewed more than 2,000 people in its study on civility and manners called Aggravating Circumstances, a status report on rudeness in America. The group revealed that 8 in 10 Americans said a lack of respect and courtesy is a serious problem, and 6 in 10 reported that things have become worse in recent years. More than a third, or 35%, admitted to being aggressive drivers. 3/4 of those surveyed said they've often seen customers treat sales staff rudely, and 46% also claimed they have walked out of a store because of the way the staff treated them. 77% held that telemarketing is rude and pushy, but nearly everyone surveyed, or 94%, agreed that the biggest complaint is to call a company and get a recording instead of a human being. While 3/4 of the respondents believed that people have become more caring and thoughtful to others after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, only 34% said the feeling would last a long time. 46% thought it would last only a few months, and 18% believed it was already over. More than 2/3, or 71%, say they have witnessed parents shouting at coaches, referees, or players. The Chinese say everyone hits a rat that crosses the street, and dogs bully the tiger that descends to the plains. David was the great Jewish hope to the throne, the next in line to succeed Saul, and a Zorro or Robin Hood figure to the masses. People should thank him for his victories over Goliath and the Philistines, but they heard reports that he was Saul's enemy. He had no army, and he had befriended Moab. 1 Samuel 22:4. All of a sudden, David was out of luck, out of favor, and out on his own. The former hero would soon be the ex-son-in-law of Saul. 1 Samuel 25:44. How do you respond when you are treated like dirt or scum? How could you do if you are pushed out, pushed too far, and pushed to the edge? First, think it through over again. Do not excite your heart or decide when you are angry. 1 Samuel chapter 25, verses 2 to 12. A certain man in Maon, who had property there at Carmel, was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband, a Calebite, was surly and mean in his dealings. While David was in the desert, he heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. So he sent 10 young men and said to them, "Go up to Nabal at Carmel and greet him in my name. Say to him, 'Long life to you, good health to you and your household, and good health to all that is yours.' Now I hear that it is sheep shearing time. When your shepherds were with us, we did not mistreat them, and the whole time they were at Carmel, nothing of theirs was missing. Ask your own servants, and they will tell you. Therefore, be favorable toward my young men, since we come at a festive time. Please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them." When David's men arrived, they gave Nabal this message in David's name. Then they waited. Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from the masters these days. Why should I take my bread and water, and the meat I have slaughtered for my shearers, and give it to men coming from who knows where?" David's men turned around and went back. When they arrived, they reported every word. A mournful-looking man walked into a bar and asked for a shot of whiskey. He gulped it down, then pounded on the bar for 2 more. The bartender looked at him quizzically and said, "Buddy, you'll be in a mess of trouble if you down a couple more of those. Slow down a bit." The unhappy boozer replied, "Hey, living dangerously is in my blood. 20 years ago, my dad was the first guy to ever jump from a plane 2,000 feet up without a parachute. 10 years later, my brother was the second man to ever do it. A couple of years ago, my mother was the first woman to jump out of a plane at 3,000 feet without a parachute, and tomorrow I'll be the first to jump out of a jumbo jet without a parachute." The incredulous bartender said, "That is crazy. Don't you know that you could be killed?" "Of course," the customer replied, "but what have I got to live for? I've got no father, no mother, no brother." Someone has said, temperamental is 95% temper and 5% mental. Thomas à Kempis, the author of The Imitation of Christ, said, "Be not angry that you cannot make others as you wish them to be, since you cannot make yourself as you wish to be." David once almost lost his head when he was insulted. He tried hard to be good, to be a nice guy, to do the right thing, but he had it with tycoons like Nabal up to the neck, and sick and tired of people like him. David and his men had done much for Nabal. They were no freeloaders, extortionists, or beggars. According to Nabal's servant, verse 15, David and his men had volunteered to guard Nabal's flocks from bandits, thieves, and wild animals for an extended period of time without pay or complaints, but they were looked down, laughed at, and taken for granted. Nabal had the means and the grounds to offer a token gift to David and his men. He was not just wealthy, he was very wealthy, or very great, verse 2. 3,000 sheep was a large figure. The only biblical figure described in Hebrew as very great and with comparable numbers was Job. Job, the greatest man among all the people in the East in his time, owned 7,000 sheep. Job 1:3. Nabal had about half the wealth of Job and feasted like a king, verse 36. What he wasted on one meal was enough for David and his men. David approached Nabal like a gentleman. He made sure his intentions were not misunderstood. The word peace occurs 4 times in verses 5 to 6. The Hebrew text says, "Shalom, him in my name, shalom to you, shalom to your house, and shalom to all that you have." David did not specify sheep, goat, or crop and how much he needed. He left it to Nabal's generosity and wisdom. Whatever he could find, verse 8, or was on hand was good enough. It need not cost Nabal an arm or a leg, only what he could afford to give. David's men were courteous and humble and said, "Please," verse 8, or in Hebrew, "I pray." But Nabal did not even check with his servants, as David had asked him to, verse 8, and he sent them away with nothing but insults. Nabal's insult was too much for David to stomach or swallow. Not only did Nabal fail to offer meat, he did not provide water that was free and bread that cost little. He used the personal pronoun my 4 times to humiliate David, verse 11. The Hebrew text is, "Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men whom I do not know they are from?" To add insult to futility, he called David a runaway servant, verse 10, even though David politely referred to Nabal as a father figure, verse 8, "your son." The messengers were not spared the abuse when Nabal questioned who they were, where they were from, and what they had done. Second, talk it out with others. Do not lose your head or jump to conclusions. 1 Samuel chapter 25, verses 13 to 22. David said to his men, "Put on your swords." So they put on their swords, and David put on his. About 400 men went up with David, while 200 stayed with the supplies. One of the servants told Nabal's wife, Abigail, "David sent messengers from the desert to give our master his greetings, but he hurled insults at them. Yet these men were very good to us. They did not mistreat us, and the whole time we were out in the fields near them, nothing was missing. Night and day they were a wall around us all the time we were herding our sheep near them. Now, think it over and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him." Abigail lost no time. She took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 5 shawls of roasted grain, and 100 cakes of raisins, and 200 cakes of pressed figs, and loaded them on donkeys. Then she told her servants, "Go on ahead, I'll follow you." But she did not tell her husband Nabal. As she came riding her donkey into a mountain ravine, there were David and his men descending toward her, and she met them. David had just said, "It's been useless, all my watching over this fellow's property in the desert so that nothing of his was missing. He has paid me back evil for good. May God deal with David, be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him." Statesman and Nobel Peace Prize winner General George C. Marshall, 1880 to 1959, has a 3-step formula that is simple to remember and effective in use on handling people. First, listen to the other person's story. Second, listen to the other person's full story. And third, listen to the other person's full story first. Vern McClellan said, "Consider the hammer. It keeps its head. It doesn't fly off the handle. It keeps pounding away. It finds the point, then drives it home. It looks at the other side, too, and thus clinches the matter. It makes mistakes, but when it does, it starts all over." David had not seen such an ill-natured, ill-mannered, and ill-speaking man before. He thought that there was nothing good about Nabal, but there was. The people who surrounded him, that is, his servants and his wife, were moral, kind, classy people. They were not miserly, mean, and macho like Nabal. One of the servants, verse 14, put in a good word for David and his men before the mistress of the house. Nabal's wife, Abigail, was more outstanding than other biblical beauties. She was one of the 10 Old Testament, along with Sarai, Genesis 12:10, Rachel, Genesis 29:17, 2 Tamars, 2 Samuel 13:1 and 14:27, Abishag, 1 Kings 1:3, Esther, Esther 2:7, and Job's 3 daughters, Job 42:15, who were described as beautiful in Hebrew, with one exception. Abigail was not just beautiful, she had beauty and brains. Abigail is the only beauty in the Bible praised for her intelligence and beauty in the same sentence. In one breath, she was noted for her intelligence first and beauty second. The Hebrew text extolled her for her good understanding. Not only was she the first person in the Bible noted for her intelligence, she was the only known individual with having good understanding in Hebrew. Verse 3, not just understanding. Abigail had something money cannot buy, makeup cannot provide, and men cannot repress, something more powerful accompanying her than muscles, bodyguards, and weapons, namely brains. She was smart in the head, swift on her feet, and sharp with her words. What then was an intelligent woman like Abigail doing with a foolish man like Nabal? She made his money grow and kept him from more trouble. Further, the Bible never said Nabal was unfaithful, abusive, or ugly. Abigail was someone a husband, a servant, verse 14, a stranger could talk to. Nabal's servants could interrupt her schedule, bring their problems, and seek her counsel, verse 14. They knew she would find a solution, make things right, and break the deadlock. She understood the heart of her servants who called her husband a wicked man, verse 17, and she even washed the feet of David's men, verse 41. Her intelligence was the ability to size things up, seize the moment, and save the day. Abigail had to act, and quickly. She had no time or opportunity to persuade her drunken husband, verse 36. This is the chapter with the most made haste references in Hebrew. Lost no time in verse 18 or quickly in verses 23, 34, and 42 in the Bible. Surely made haste in the intense form in Hebrew. Abigail brought 5 out of the 3,000 sheep to the men. 5 of 3,000 sheep was nothing. Wolves could have plundered more. She fell on her face, bowed to the ground, verse 23, dropped at his feet, verse 24, and said in Hebrew, "Upon me, my Lord, the sin." With one act, she took her husband's and David's foolishness, selfishness, and pettiness on herself. Verse 24. David's foolish imperative in verse 13, put on your swords, was reversed by her three wise imperatives in verse 19, 24, and 28. Go on ahead, hear, and forgive. She also called herself David's servant, using the lowly title, your servant, 7 times, a record use of the phrase by a biblical character, verses 24, 24, 25, 27, 28, 31, and 41. She overturned her husband's insult of David as a runaway slave by referring to David 14 times as my Lord. Verses 24, twice in 25, twice in 26, twice in 27, twice in 28, 29, 30, and thrice in 31. Whatever aches David suffered were healed by the balm and bandage of her words. Further, she interjected her speech with please or I pray in verses 24, 28, and also 25 not recorded in the NIV. Third, turn it over to God. Do not soil your hands or rush into judgment. 1 Samuel chapter 25, verses 32 to 35. David said to Abigail, Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who has kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak. Then David accepted from her hand what she had brought him and said, Go home in peace. I have heard your words and granted your request. Someone has said, good advice is hard to get. Good advice is worth a fortune, and good advice is rarer than rubies. 4 centuries ago, Francois de la Rochefoucauld said, Good advice is something a man gives when he is too old to set a bad example. Here are some quotes on advice from quotelady.com. Advice is what we ask for when we already know the answer but wish we didn't. Giving advice is sometimes only showing our wisdom at the expense of others. He who can take advice is sometimes superior to him who can give it. I sometimes give myself admirable advice, but I am incapable of taking it. If you can distinguish between good advice and bad advice, then you don't need advice. People are always willing to follow advice when it accords with their own wishes. Some people like my advice so much that they frame it upon the wall instead of using it. Dispensing good advice is an art, so is heeding good advice. Most people are wise after a mistake, a misunderstanding, or a mishap, and seldom before. David knew he was standing by, staring at, and sitting on a gold mine of advice from Abigail. She coaxed him into thinking theologically, morally, and historically. The phrase, the Lord, was mentioned 7 times in her impassioned speech to David. Verses 26 twice, twice in verse 28, 29, 30, and 31. Morally, she twice stated the weakness of giving into bloodshed and vengeance. After her introduction and at the conclusion, verses 26 and 31, beginning with, Let no wrongdoing be found in you as long as you live, verse 28, and culminating with, My master will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or of having avenged himself, verse 31. She warned him that shedding innocent blood was crossing the point of no return. Historically, she said words familiar to him, referring to the sling, verse 29, David used to fight Goliath, 1 Samuel 17:40, 49, and 50. After Nabal died, she had no reason to marry David. She was rich, and he had nothing but hopes, but she believed in David, his roots, his redemption, and his reign, and his deliverance, dreams, and destiny. She used the word captain or leader, verse 30, that was used of Saul up to this point, 1 Samuel 9:16, 10:1 and 13:14. David acknowledged that Abigail saved him from doing evil, verse 39, from behaving and being like Saul, who wiped out a city and its inhabitants. The young David was a fugitive, but never a murderer, bandit, or a thug. He recognized God was at work, sending him a message through Abigail, verse 32. David confessed he was not only on the way to doing wrong, but also committing evil, verse 39, when he decided to take justice into his own hands, verse 33. Conclusion. Everyone has a bottom line and a sore foot and a bad day, but two wrongs do not make a right. Are you weary in doing good? Galatians 6:9, 2 Thessalonians 3:13. Do you seize the moment, not sparing a second to right wrong? Do you save the day instead of spoiling the day? Do you seek to forgive, heal, and bless others at all times and not only in good times? Bible study questions. Group study. 1. List the characters. 2. When is the time for shearing sheep? 3. Where is the wilderness of Paran? Verse 1. Where is Maon? Carmel. Verse 2. Where is the field? Verse 15. Where is the hill? Verse 20. 4. What was David's request of Naboth? Was it reasonable? What kind of life did Naboth previously live? 5. Why did Abigail not tell her husband about David? 6. How did Abigail approach Naboth? How did she address Naboth? Compare and contrast. 1. Naboth's temperament. David's temperament. How Naboth incensed David. How Abigail inspired David. Progression. Naboth's life. How Abigail approached David. How God guided David. From Doris, the psychologist's desk. Abigail, an intelligent and beautiful woman, had married Nabal, a man known to be surly and mean in his dealings. In the old days, women could not choose their spouse. In modern days, we are all reminded to be alert and make good choices in regard to finding a spouse. Despite all effort to be cautious and have our eyes wide open, one cannot guarantee your spouse remains a good person. The reality is that it is possible that couples grow apart in marriage and one spouse may have gone awry and become very difficult to live with, or they have a major personality issue or even disorder, and they may be so hardened it seems impossible to bring them back. What then can we do as we seek to be faithful to our marriage vow? In 1 Samuel 25, we learn from Abigail how to cope with such a situation. Abigail was one of the few women in the Bible who had godly wisdom. Her wisdom and demeanor saved her husband as well as the whole household from a violent attack. She also helped David, her future second husband, from a tirade that would harm his integrity and relationship with God. At times, one spouse may have circumstances beyond his or her control, such as physical illness or mental illness, such as depression or anxiety, rendering it very difficult for the person to fulfill one's spousal and parental responsibilities. Tips. 1. Take responsibility to take care of yourself and your children. There comes a time when you need to take charge and act for the welfare of the household. When the matter is not only for your own needs and interests, you need to be responsible for others as well. 2. Seek God for extra wisdom and love for Him in handling the challenges in your marriage. 3. If your spouse has a substance abuse problem, such as Nabal, you may not be able to do much and professional intervention may be needed. Note that Abigail did not say anything to Nabal until he was sober. Sometimes you may need professional guidance to coach you along when your spouse is actively in sin or stuck in problems such as addictions, alcoholism, drug abuse, sexual addictions. 4. The family is a unit. Sometimes we may have to pick up the slack when our spouse is struggling with problems. A note of caution, however, is not to try to solve everything on your own. This may gradually evolve into a relationship where a spouse feels unnecessary in the picture and thus seeks affirmation outside the marriage. This is particularly the case for capable women. Sometimes you can manage all child care or education as well as household responsibilities better than your spouse. However, do not simply take things over. You would want your spouse to take an active role. For example, you may be surprised that your husband may do a great job helping your child do homework. For men, sometimes they feel like they are financially responsible to spare their spouse from work and provide for all their needs. Nowadays, there's a lot of pressure for men to be financially capable, emotionally available, and also to be a super dad. This may become too stressful. At times, some work may be good for your wife's personal development. Sharing financial responsibilities may also be good for the marriage. It is good to pray together to reflect on the division of labor and whether it is working for both of you at different stages in life. Reflect regularly on your changes, growth, and development so that you will not drift apart. Also, watch out so that one spouse does not shoulder a set of responsibilities for too long that it creates unnecessary hurt or even resentment. Group sharing. Invite someone in advance to share a testimony of change from negative to positive. After the sharing, other couples can affirm and share what they learned from their testimony. Couples sharing. Share about how you divide family responsibilities and household chores. Is it balanced? Do both sides feel comfortable with the arrangements? Examine whether this arrangement is good for each other and for the family as a unit. List the pros and cons, carefully considering whether it is good for each other's relationship with God. Then consider other aspects such as whether it is good for the children, etc. Plan an activity in which you would be able to understand your spouse's activity and responsibility from his or her perspectives. Example, teaching a child to do homework or shopping for clothes for kids, managing the text forums, etc. Remember that this swapping is meant for fun and enrichment. Be sure to show appreciation for each other's contribution to the family.